My name is Harrison Caldwell. I am 70 years old. For most of my life, I lived in a world defined by rules, evidence, and absolute truth. But none of that prepared me for the moment my own flesh and blood tried to erase my existence. When I walked into that cold, sterile courtroom, my hands were trembling. I was wearing a worn-out flannel shirt and muddy boots, the exact picture of a defeated, broken man. My daughter Valerie sat at the plaintiff's table. She leaned over to her husband Trent, and I saw her smirk. She whispered, "Look at the confused old man we have won." Trent just shook his head with a look of absolute disgust. To them, I was nothing more than a senile obstacle, a burden standing between them and my estate. They were ready to strip away my rights, my property, and my dignity. But then Judge Mitchell Weaver walked in and took his seat at the bench. He opened the file, adjusted his glasses, and glanced down at the respondent. His eyes met mine. I watched the color completely drain from his face. His hand began to tremble so violently that he dropped his wooden pen onto the desk with a sharp clatter. The entire courtroom fell dead silent. His lips parted, and in a hoarse whisper that echoed through the room, he said, "My God, is it really him?" Everyone turned and stared at me. Valerie's smirk vanished. Trent frowned in confusion. They had absolutely no clue who I really was, or the history I shared with the man sitting behind that gavel. They thought they were hunting a frail farmer. They did not realize they had cornered a predator who simply retired 15 years ago. To understand how my own daughter ended up trying to legally bury me alive, we have to go back exactly 3 months. It was the day after I buried my beautiful wife, Diane. Diane and I were married for 45 years. She was the anchor of my soul, the reason I walked away from my demanding career to live a quiet life on our historic Bucks County estate. When her heart gave out suddenly, my world shattered into a million pieces. The grief was a physical weight, a suffocating fog that made it hard to even breathe. The morning after we laid her to rest, I was sitting in my armchair in the living room staring blindly at the empty fireplace. That is when the front door swung open. I heard the heavy rhythmic thud of wheels rolling across the hardwood floor. I blinked through my tears and walked out into the foyer. Trent and Valerie were dragging massive, expensive designer suitcases through my front door. Trent did not even knock. He just pushed past me with 2 heavy leather bags, acting like he owned the place. Valerie followed closely behind, carrying a stack of garment bags. They had not asked if they could stay. They had not even mentioned a visit. They simply moved in while the dirt on my wife's grave was still fresh. I stood there confused and numb, watching these 2 people treat my quiet sanctuary like a hotel lobby. "Valerie," I said, my voice rough and exhausted from days of crying. "What is going on here? Why are you bringing all this luggage inside?" Valerie stopped at the foot of the grand staircase. She dropped the bags, rushed over to me, and put on a mask of deep, agonizing, daughterly concern. She gently grabbed my arms, looking into my eyes with an expression of pure pity. "Dad, you are grieving," she murmured, using that soft, patronizing tone people use with young children. "You just lost Mom. You absolutely cannot be alone in this massive house right now. It is simply not safe." I frowned, pulling my arms back slightly. "I am fine, Valerie. I just need some peace and quiet to process everything." Trent stepped forward, wiping his hands on his expensive slacks. "Come on, Pop," Trent said smoothly. "Let us be realistic here. The house is too big for you to manage alone. Besides, we spoke to your doctor at the hospital after Diane passed. The doctor said severe trauma can cause extreme memory lapses and cognitive delays in someone your age. We are just here to take care of you." Memory lapses. I repeated, feeling a strange tightening in my chest. "I have not had any memory lapses." Valerie sighed dramatically and placed a hand on her chest. "Dad, do you not remember leaving the front door wide open last night? Do you not remember putting the milk in the pantry instead of the refrigerator? You are struggling, and that is okay. You do not have to fight this alone. We are going to stay here and handle the daily chores so you can just rest." I stared at her. I had no memory of leaving the door open, but my mind had been a blurry mess of sorrow and exhaustion since the paramedics took Diane away. The grief was so consuming that I genuinely doubted my own reality for a fleeting moment. Maybe she was right. Maybe the shock had scrambled my thoughts. I looked at Trent, who was already carrying a box of his premium liquors into my kitchen, making himself completely at home. He did not look like a grieving son-in-law. He looked like a man staking a claim on a new territory. But I was simply too exhausted to argue. The pain of losing Diane had drained every ounce of fight out of my bones. I nodded slowly, rubbing my tired eyes. "Fine," I whispered, turning my back on them and retreating toward the hallway. "Just take the guest suite on the second floor. Please do not touch Diane's garden, and just give me some space." I walked away, retreating into the lonely silence of my study, firmly believing that my daughter was acting out of love. I believed she was putting her own life on hold to comfort her aging, heartbroken father. I wanted to believe it with every fiber of my being. But as I sat alone in the dark, surrounded by the heavy silence of an empty house, a tiny persistent whisper in the back of my mind told me that something was terribly wrong. I did not know it yet, but letting them through my front door that morning was the single biggest mistake of my life. The luggage they dragged in was not meant for a short visit. It was the first quiet step of an invasion. And the compassionate daughter who claimed she wanted to protect me was already plotting to bury me entirely and claim everything that belonged to my wife and me. They assumed my grief had made me weak, fragile, and blind to their true intentions. They assumed the old man sitting in the dark would quietly surrender his mind, his wealth, and his history to their insatiable greed. They were wrong. This house was my fortress, and I would never let them take it from me without fighting back with total vengeance. The tipping point arrived on a Tuesday night, exactly 24 days after they moved in. I woke up at 2 a.m. My chest felt tight, my throat was burning, and my eyes watered before I even opened them. It took my sleep-addled brain a few seconds to register the heavy, suffocating odor filling the room. It was natural gas. The smell was so thick, it tasted like metal on my tongue. I threw off the heavy quilt and stumbled out of bed. My bare feet hit the cold hardwood floor. I coughed, pulling the collar of my pajama shirt over my nose and mouth. I moved quickly down the hallway, tracing the toxic cloud toward its source. The house was pitch black, silent except for the faint, steady hissing sound echoing from the first floor. I hurried down the grand staircase, my hand gripping the banister to keep from falling. The smell grew overwhelmingly strong as I reached the main foyer and turned toward the kitchen. I did not turn on the lights. Any spark could have blown the entire estate to ashes. I navigated by the moonlight filtering through the bay windows. When I reached the kitchen island, I saw it. All 4 dials on our professional-grade gas range were turned completely open. The heavy hissing was deafening in the quiet room. Raw gas was pumping freely into the house. I lunged forward and slammed the dials shut one by one, cutting off the flow. I grabbed the edge of the granite countertop, gasping for clean air, my heart hammering furiously against my ribs. How could this happen? I had not been in the kitchen since noon. I had not cooked anything. Suddenly, the harsh fluorescent overhead lights snapped on, blinding me. I shielded my eyes. Trent was standing in the doorway wearing a silk robe, his eyes wide with exaggerated panic. "Oh my God!" Trent shouted, rushing into the room and dramatically covering his mouth. Valerie was right behind him. She let out a piercing, theatrical gasp. She darted across the kitchen, throwing open the window above the sink, letting the freezing night air rush in. Then she turned to me. She rushed to my side, grabbing my shoulders, her face twisted into a mask of pure terror. "Dad." "What did you do?" she cried out, her voice echoing shrilly against the tile walls. "You left the stove on. You turned the gas on and just walked away. You could have killed us all." I coughed, trying to clear my burning throat, and shook my head. I was not in here, Valerie. I did not touch the stove. I have been in my bedroom since 8 o'clock. Valerie's eyes welled up with tears, real tears falling down her cheeks. It was an incredible performance. Dad. Please, she sobbed, clutching my arms tighter. You came down here an hour ago. I heard you. You said you wanted to make a cup of tea. I watched you put the kettle on, and then you just wandered off. You forgot. The doctor warned us this would happen. He said the trauma of losing Mom would trigger severe memory lapses. The dementia is starting, Dad. You are completely losing track of reality. I stared at my daughter. I had not come down for tea. I despise herbal tea. Diane was the one who drank tea before bed. I only drank black coffee and never afternoon. But Valerie was looking at me with such absolute pitying conviction that for a terrifying fraction of a second, I wondered if I was losing my mind. Was my grief truly destroying my brain? Trent stepped forward, playing the role of the calm, rational mediator. He placed a heavy, comforting hand on my shoulder. Look, Pop, it is okay. Nobody is angry. We know you are struggling. This house is just too much for you to handle right now. Your mind is overwhelmed. But we cannot have accidents like this. Next time the house might catch fire. We need to make sure you are protected. Before I could process his words, Trent turned around and picked up a manila folder from the dining table. He pulled out a crisp white document and a heavy silver fountain pen, sliding them smoothly across the kitchen island toward me. It is just a temporary medical power of attorney. Trent said, his voice soothing and measured. It is completely standard. It just gives Valerie the legal authority to make healthcare and household decisions for you, just in case of an emergency. Just in case your memory slips again and you need immediate help. It is a precaution, Pop, to keep you safe. I looked down at the document. The legal jargon was dense, but my eyes caught the key phrases. Full medical proxy. Financial oversight. It was not a precaution. It was the first shackle. A blank check to dictate my life. I reached toward the silver pen. My fingers hovered over the metal. The frantic energy vanished, replaced by expectant silence. I kept my head bowed, playing the compliant elder, but I shifted my gaze upward. I looked at Trent. He ignored the document completely. He was looking at his wrist. He was checking his expensive gold watch. It was nearly 3 a.m. Why would a man who barely escaped a gas explosion care about the exact time? Then Trent looked up and caught Valerie's eye. He gave her a look. It was not relief. It was a sharp, fleeting, triumphant smirk. A silent confirmation of victory. Valerie's shoulders relaxed, and the terrified daughter vanished. Her expression was hard, calculating, and victorious. In that single exchange, the fog of my grief evaporated. The confused widower was gone. The dormant instincts of a seasoned prosecutor, a man who spent 3 decades reading the tells of liars, flared to life with clarity. They had staged the gas leak. They intentionally flooded my home with poison to terrorize me into signing away my autonomy. They were not trying to protect me. They were trying to cage me. I had to stop this immediately. But I knew if I confronted them now, they would find a violent way to remove me. I needed time. I moved my hand toward the pen, and right as my fingers touched the metal, I initiated my performance. I violently jerked my hand back. I forced my fingers to tremble uncontrollably, knocking the pen off the counter. It clattered loudly against the floor. I let out a weak gasp, clutching my right hand against my chest, as if I were suffering from a sudden tremor. My hand, I mumbled, slurring my words slightly. It will not stop shaking. Valerie stepped forward, her voice sharp with frustration. Dad, just pick it up. You need to sign this right now. I shook my head, swaying slightly on my feet. I cannot. I whispered, my voice incredibly frail and broken. I am so tired, Valerie. The gas made my head spin. I feel dizzy. Let me sleep. I will sign it tomorrow. I promise. Tomorrow. Trent exhaled sharply. Fine then. Tomorrow, Pop. No excuses. No. Those words hung in the stale air of the kitchen, long after Trent and Valerie had turned their backs and marched upstairs. I stood alone in the dim moonlight, my heart thumping a heavy, irregular rhythm against my ribs. I waited until I heard the solid click of their bedroom door shutting on the second floor. Only then did I allow my trembling hand to drop to my side. The tremor vanished instantly. My fingers were perfectly steady. I carefully picked up the heavy silver fountain pen from the floor and placed it back on the granite counter. I did not go back to sleep. I retreated to my bedroom, but rest was entirely impossible. My mind was racing, pulling apart the layers of what had just happened. The gas leak was not an accident of an aging mind. It was a deliberate, calculated attack. For hours I lay on top of the covers, staring at the shadows dancing across the ceiling. Every creak of the old house sounded like a threat. My home, the sanctuary Diane and I had built, felt like a cage closing in around me. By 3 a.m, my throat was parched. The lingering metallic taste of the gas still coated my mouth, demanding to be washed away. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed and stood up. The hardwood floors were freezing against my bare feet, but I welcomed the chill. It kept me sharp. It kept me grounded. I stepped out into the hallway, moving with the quiet, deliberate steps of a man who knows every hidden creak in his own floorboards. I was heading back to the kitchen for a glass of ice water, but as I passed the top of the main staircase, something caught my eye. A faint, unnatural glow was bleeding out from the ground floor hallway. It was a sharp, bluish-white light sweeping back and forth in jerky, erratic movements. It was coming from my study. My study was a room that was strictly off-limits. I had locked that heavy oak door myself just after dinner, securing the deadbolt. Yet, the distinct beam of a flashlight was slicing through the narrow gap underneath the doorframe. My breath caught in my throat. I descended the stairs, keeping close to the wall to avoid making a sound. When I reached the bottom step, I crept down the hallway until I was standing directly outside my study. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar, the lock expertly bypassed. I pressed my cheek against the cold wood and peered through the narrow opening. Inside, Trent was kneeling on the Persian rug. He was no longer wearing his silk robe. He was fully dressed in dark clothing, holding a high-powered tactical flashlight between his teeth. Both of his hands were frantically working over my antique floor safe. That safe was a heavy iron monolith that Diane and I had bought from a bank auction decades ago. It held my most sensitive documents, our original marriage certificate, and a significant amount of emergency cash. Trent was entirely focused on the combination dial. He held his sleek, modern smartphone in one hand, snapping rapid, detailed photographs of the intricate locking mechanism from multiple angles. He was trying to figure out the manufacturer, looking for a serial number or a bypass code to break it open. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, his face illuminated by the harsh glare of the phone screen. His arrogance from the kitchen was gone, replaced by a desperate, feverish intensity. He looked like a cornered animal trying to claw his way out of a trap. I watched him twist the heavy brass dial, leaning his ear close to the metal, trying to listen for the internal tumblers to click into place. I shifted my weight, preparing to step away, but the toe of my boot snagged the edge of the hall runner. My shoulder bumped hard against the oak door. The heavy wood groaned, swinging open a few inches with a loud, betraying creak. Trent jumped as if he had been shocked with the live wire. The flashlight dropped from his teeth, clattering against the iron safe, and his phone screen went dark instantly. He spun around, scrambling to his feet. He saw me standing in the doorway, wrapped in the shadows of the hall. He froze, his chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically for an excuse. Then the slick, lying salesman returned. He let out a nervous, breathless chuckle and casually kicked the flashlight under the desk. "Just checking the security window sensors," Pop Trent said, his voice dripping with forced, jovial relief. I thought I heard a raccoon scratching at the glass. You know how those critters can be. I did not want them getting into your beautiful books. You really should not be wandering around in the dark, Pop. You could fall and hurt yourself. Let us get you back up to bed." I looked at the heavy iron safe, then back to his smiling, treacherous face. I let my shoulders slump perfectly, adopting the posture of a bewildered, sleepy old man. "A raccoon," I muttered, vaguely rubbing my eyes. Yes, those raccoons are a nuisance." "Thank you, Trent." I turned slowly and walked back up the stairs, leaving him alone in the dark. The next morning, the house was remarkably quiet. Valerie announced cheerfully over breakfast that she and Trent were going into town to meet with a contractor about some essential home renovations they claimed I needed for my safety. They drove off in their luxury SUV, leaving me entirely alone. The moment their taillights vanished down the long driveway, the helpless old man routine vanished with them. I marched straight into the kitchen. I needed to know exactly how the gas leak had happened. Diane and I had installed that professional-grade stove 10 years ago. It was equipped with an automatic safety ignition valve. If a dial was turned without the igniter clicking, the internal valve was designed to block the gas flow within 3 seconds to prevent an explosion. I pulled open the heavy utility drawer and retrieved my old heavy magnifying glass and a small metal scraper. I leaned over the stove and carefully removed the heavy iron grates and the burner caps. I inspected the primary ignition mechanism. Under the magnifying glass, the truth was undeniable, glaring, and malicious. Deep inside the delicate brass housing of the safety valve, someone had packed a thick, dark substance. I used the metal scraper to dig a tiny portion out and rubbed it between my fingers. It was thick, industrial-grade lithium grease, the kind of dense lubricant used for heavy machinery, not kitchen appliances. It was intentionally jammed into the valve to stop the safety sensor from engaging. It was not a random, tragic accident. It was not a symptom of my fading memory or creeping dementia. My own flesh and blood daughter and her husband had deliberately sabotaged the stove, pumping deadly gas into the house while I slept, building a terrifying narrative to prove I was losing my mind. I washed the dark grease from my fingertips, letting the cold water run over my hands until my skin turned pale. If they wanted a broken old man, I would give them the performance of a lifetime. I needed them absolutely confident in their own narrative. Overconfidence breeds carelessness, and careless people leave mistakes behind. I walked back to my bedroom and deliberately dressed myself in a heavy plaid shirt, making sure it was inside out. I mismatched my socks and left my silver hair uncombed and wild. I slouched my shoulders, letting my spine curve forward, simulating the fragile posture of a man whose mind was slipping away into the shadows. I shuffled slowly down the grand staircase, dragging my left foot slightly across the polished wood, creating a rhythmic, pathetic, scuffing sound that echoed through the quiet house. I navigated toward the kitchen, where the scent of freshly brewed espresso filled the air. Valerie was standing by the island, pouring a cup of coffee, dressed in athletic wear. When she heard my shuffling footsteps, she turned around. I stopped in the doorway, letting my jaw hang slack, and stared blankly at the wall past her shoulder. I did not focus on her face. I looked through her as if I were lost in a fog that I could not navigate. For a split second, before she could put on her mask of daughterly concern, I saw her true reaction. Valerie rolled her eyes. It was a visceral, unmistakable expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. She looked at me not as a father who was suffering, but as a piece of rotting garbage that had somehow wandered into her pristine kitchen. Then she blinked, and the mask snapped back into place. "Dad," she said, her voice dropping into that sickeningly sweet, patronizing register. "Oh, look at you. You put your shirt on inside out today. Are you feeling mixed up this morning?" I blinked, slowly raising a trembling hand to my chest, tracing the exposed seams of the fabric, as if I were utterly bewildered by them. "I suppose I was in a rush," I mumbled, slurring my words, keeping my gaze fixed on the floorboards. "I was looking for Diane." "Have you seen your mother this morning?" I saw Valerie clench her jaw. She took a deep breath, playing the role of the patient, grieving daughter. Dad. Mom is gone, remember? She passed away. Come sit down. Let me get you some water. Just then, Trent walked into the kitchen wearing running shorts and a towel draped over his broad shoulders. He carried his sleek leather briefcase, dropping it carelessly onto the dining table. I am jumping in the shower, Val, he announced, grabbing a bottle of water from the refrigerator. I have that Zoom call with the financial planner in 20 minutes. Keep an eye on the stove, will you? He shot me a mocking glance. Valerie nodded, waving him off. Trent jogged up the back staircase, whistling a cheerful tune. The moment I heard the sound of the shower running from the second floor, my trembling stopped entirely. I straightened my spine. The fog in my eyes evaporated. Valerie turned her back to me, loading her coffee cup into the dishwasher, completely ignoring the supposedly confused old man sitting at her table. This was my window. I stood up, my movements completely silent and precise, and slipped out of the kitchen. I moved swiftly down the quiet hallway and slowly climbed the main wooden staircase, my heavy winter boots making absolutely no sound on the thick carpet runners. I approached the suite. The door was closed, but not locked. I pushed it open and stepped inside the room that used to belong to my wife and me, now cluttered with their expensive luggage and scattered clothing. Trent had left his briefcase on the dining table downstairs, but he brought a secondary, smaller leather document bag into the bedroom. It was sitting squarely on the edge of the mattress. It was secured with a combination lock and a brass keyhole. People like Trent rely on expensive security, assuming it makes them invincible. But during my early years as a prosecutor, I had learned a thing or two from the brilliant, desperate men I used to put behind bars. I pulled a small, sturdy paperclip from my pocket, unfolding the metal wire into a straight line with a tiny hook at the end. I knelt beside the bed and pressed my ear close to the leather bag. I slid the makeshift tool into the brass keyhole, applying gentle, steady pressure, while I slowly turned the first combination dial. I listened past the rushing sound of the shower down the hall. I waited for the microscopic, satisfying click of the internal tumbler. It took less than 30 seconds. The brass latch popped open with a quiet snap. I unzipped the leather bag, bypassing the superficial layer of printed emails and generic bank statements. I dug my fingers deep into the concealed side pocket of the lining. My hand brushed against a thick, glossy paper stock. I pulled it out. It was a very thick, high-quality, triple-folded brochure. The cover featured a photograph of serene, elderly people sitting on a sunlit lawn. The bold blue letters across the top read, "Shady Pines Mental Facility, providing compassionate care for your transitioning loved ones." My blood ran cold. Shady Pines was not a compassionate care center. It was a notoriously underfunded state-run asylum located hours away in a desolate industrial district. It was a dumping ground for the forgotten, plagued by reports of heavy sedation and severe neglect. It was the kind of institution where people went in and simply ceased to exist, stripped of their names and their dignity, kept sedated until they quietly expired. But the brochure was not the most horrifying part. Pinned to the back of the glossy pamphlet was a stack of legal documents. I gently flipped it over. The heading on the top page was printed in black ink. It read, "Involuntary Psychiatric Commitment Form." My eyes scanned down the page, taking in the cold, clinical language designed to strip a human being of their freedom. The reality of their plan crystallized instantly. Trent and Valerie were not waiting for me to slowly deteriorate. They were not just trying to steal my money. The blank spaces on the official document had already been filled out in neat typography. My name, Harrison Caldwell, was typed perfectly on the line designating the patient to be committed. They had listed Valerie as the primary petitioner, citing severe dementia, violent tendencies, and an inability to care for myself as legal justifications for my immediate removal. This was not a vague idea for the future. It was an active, imminent threat. They had the paperwork completely prepared. They were going to lock me inside a living nightmare. I stared silently at my forged signature at the bottom. They had already signed my life away. I placed the heavy, horrifying documents back into the dark, concealed pocket, quietly zipping the smooth leather bag and firmly snapping the small brass lock shut to carefully erase any remaining trace of my presence before I slowly stood up from the bedroom floor. I stepped out of their bedroom, carefully pulling the door shut until the latch clicked silently. The realization of my profound isolation hit me like a physical blow. I was entirely alone in a house I owned, surrounded by predators wearing the faces of my family. I could not use my own cell phone. Trent worked in modern finance, and I had no doubt he had installed tracking software to mirror my messages. The kitchen landline would leave a digital footprint on the monthly billing statement. If I was going to fight a quiet war, I needed an untraceable weapon. I needed a secure line to the outside world before they sealed the final exits of my cage. I walked down the back stairs and slipped on my heavy winter coat, deliberately choosing a tattered, mismatched wool scarf to complete my disguise. I stepped out through the mudroom door into the biting morning air. The sprawling grounds of my estate were usually a source of comfort, but today the sweeping lawns felt like the perimeter of a high-security prison. I walked down the long gravel driveway, adopting a slow, meandering pace, wandering slightly off the path to inspect the frosted hedges just in case Valerie was watching from an upstairs window. I had to look like a man simply taking a confused, aimless morning stroll. Once I reached the main road and slipped beyond the tree line out of their sight, my posture shifted. I straightened my back, pulled my collar up against the biting wind, and began to march. The nearest gas station was exactly 2 miles down the winding rural highway. It was a punishing walk for a 70-year-old man in the freezing weather. My knees ached, and the cold air burned my lungs, but the physical pain fueled the righteous fury burning in my chest. With every step, my boots crunched against the gravel. I mapped out the legal parameters of the nightmare Trent and Valerie had engineered. They had a forged document and the element of surprise, but they did not know who they had cornered. I reached the small gas station on the edge of town. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside, shaking the frost from my shoulders. I walked past the coffee machines and went straight to the dusty display rack near the register. I selected the cheapest prepaid cellular phone they carried, along with a top-up card holding 60 minutes of talk time. The teenager behind the counter barely looked up from his magazine as he scanned the items. I paid with a crumpled $50 bill, ensuring there would be no credit card record of my presence here, and told him to keep the change. I left the store and walked around to the back of the building, sheltering myself from the wind near a stack of wooden shipping pallets. My fingers were stiff from the cold as I tore open the plastic packaging and popped the battery into the cheap phone. I waited for the generic welcome screen to glow, punching in the activation code with absolute precision. I took a deep breath, letting the icy air fill my lungs, and dialed a number I had committed to memory over 15 years ago. It was a secure line that belonged to Veronica Bates. Veronica was a former federal investigator with a terrifying talent for finding buried secrets. Decades ago, when her freedom was on the line due to a vicious political framing, I was the unseen hand that quietly dismantled her enemies and cleared her name. She had sworn a life debt to me, a debt I never intended to collect until this very moment. The line rang twice before a sharp, guarded voice answered. "State your business," Veronica said, her tone as cold as the winter air around me. "Veronica." "It is Caldwell," I replied, keeping my voice low and steady. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The silence stretched for 3 agonizing seconds before her professional armor melted away. "Mr. Caldwell," she whispered, genuine shock bleeding through her words. "It has been over a decade. I thought you had retired for good. What do you need? Tell me who to hunt." I skipped the pleasantries. There was no time to explain the heartbreak or the betrayal. I needed a soldier, not a sympathetic ear. "I need a deep-dive financial extraction on a man named Trent Lawson," I instructed firmly. "He is my son-in-law. I need a total blackout protocol. Nobody can know you are looking. Do not trigger any credit alerts or soft pulls that might ping his email. I want his bank records, his offshore holdings, his debts, his communications, and every dirty secret he has ever tried to sweep under the rug. I want to know exactly what is bleeding his bank accounts dry." "I understand," she said instantly, her fingers already clicking rapidly across a keyboard in the background. "Consider him stripped to the bone. How fast do you need the dossier?" "He has initiated a hostile legal maneuver against me," I replied, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I have a maximum of 48 hours before they try to forcibly remove me from my home. I need ammunition. Veronica and I need it immediately." "You will have a preliminary report by midnight," she promised fiercely. "I owe you my life, Caldwell. I will not let you down." I hung up the phone and slipped the plastic device deep into the inner pocket of my heavy coat. The wheels were officially in motion. I began the long, freezing trek back to my Bucks County estate. I focused on my breathing, shifting my mindset back into the role of the helpless victim. By the time I reached the wrought iron gates of my driveway, I was genuinely exhausted, adding authenticity to my disguise. As I rounded the final bend, I saw Valerie standing on the front porch. She was clutching her smartphone to her ear. "Yes, officer, he just wandered off," Valerie was saying, her voice thick with exaggerated panic. "He is completely disoriented since my mother passed. Please, you must send a patrol car immediately." She was laying the groundwork. She was establishing a documented police record of my mental decline to support the forged psychiatric commitment form waiting in Trent's briefcase. I stumbled up the final steps, letting my shoulders droop. I looked at her with vacant eyes. Valerie snapped her phone shut, grabbing my arm with bruising force. "Where have you been?" she hissed, dropping the concerned daughter act since the police were not physically here to witness it. I looked down at my muddy boots, letting a frightened whimper escape my throat. "I just went to look for the morning paper," I murmured, my voice trembling perfectly. "I am so sorry. I just wanted to read the news to your mother." Valerie stared at me with calculating disgust, completely unaware that the hunt had officially begun. I would let her believe she was in total control for just a little while longer. 2 days passed in a suffocating charade of domestic bliss. I shuffled around my own home, sipping weak broth and pretending to lose my train of thought mid-sentence. Valerie played her part flawlessly, offering patronizing smiles while quietly removing the car keys from the hook by the door. She thought she was trapping me. She did not realize I was simply waiting for my armaments to arrive. On Thursday morning, I received a short text message on my hidden burner phone. The package was ready. I waited until Trent was engrossed in a conference call, and Valerie was loudly complaining to her manicurist over the phone. I slipped out the back door, leaning heavily on a walking cane I had found in the garage. I walked the mile to a rusted collection of postal boxes on the edge of the county route. Veronica had set up a secure drop point under a fictitious name. I retrieved a compact, heavy cardboard box and shoved it deep into the lining of my oversized wool coat. The walk back was agonizing for my joints, but the adrenaline pulsing through my veins made the freezing wind feel like nothing. I returned through the mudroom, stashing the box under a pile of old gardening tarps just moments before Valerie swept into the kitchen, dressed in a sharp designer coat. "Dad, we are heading out for a few hours," Valerie announced, checking her reflection in the polished surface of the microwave. "Trent has a networking event at a boutique vineyard downtown, an exclusive wine tasting. I know you are terrified of being alone, but we simply must maintain our professional obligations." I nodded slowly, letting my hands shake as I gripped the edge of the counter. "Of course, sweetheart," I murmured, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor. "I will just sit in the study and look at your mother's old photo albums. Do not worry about me." Trent walked in smelling strongly of expensive cologne. He tossed a patronizing glance in my direction. "Try not to touch the stovetop. We do not want another disaster while we are out enjoying our vintage Pinot Noir." They laughed together, a cruel, harmonious sound, and walked out the front door. I listened to the heavy roar of their luxury utility vehicle fading down the gravel driveway. The moment the sound completely vanished, the frail, trembling widower vanished with it. I stood up straight, rolling my shoulders to release the tension of my performance. I walked briskly to the mudroom and retrieved the cardboard box. It was time to turn my home into a panopticon. I carried the box to the kitchen island and sliced it open with a paring knife. Inside rested 3 state-of-the-art microcameras. They were impeccably disguised as standard circular smoke detectors. To the untrained eye, they were invisible, mundane fixtures of domestic safety. To me, they were the ultimate witnesses. I grabbed a step stool and went to work. I installed the first camera directly above the kitchen island, positioning the wide-angle lens to capture the stove and the entire surrounding area. There would be no more mysterious gas leaks, no more fabricated accidents. The second camera went into the center of the vaulted living room ceiling, offering a completely unobstructed view of the front door, the staircase, and the main sitting area. Every whisper, every cruel remark, every stolen document would be recorded in high definition, audio and video. Finally, I moved to my study. I mounted the third smoke detector directly above my heavy oak desk, ensuring the lens had a perfect sweeping view of the antique floor safe and the primary workspace. I pulled the burner phone from my pocket and booted up the secure application Veronica had preloaded. Within seconds, the 3 camera feeds blinked to life on the small screen. The clarity was absolute. I could see every corner of my trap. I spent several minutes walking through the rooms testing the motion sensors and the audio sensitivity. The microphones were so powerful I could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. But a trap is utterly useless without the proper bait. I sat down in my heavy leather desk chair and opened my laptop. Trent was desperately searching for liquid assets to pay off a $5 million mob debt. He was a man drowning in his own arrogance, grasping at any lifeline. I was going to throw him an anvil disguised as a life preserver. I navigated to my desktop screen and right-clicked, creating a new, highly visible folder. I typed the name with deliberate precision. Offshore Trust Fund, $10 million. The sheer audacity of the title was exactly the kind of thing a greedy, panicked mind would latch onto. I spent the next 30 minutes populating the folder with dummy spreadsheets. I filled the rows and columns with complex financial jargon, routing numbers leading to dead ends and impressive-looking investment portfolios. I added fake correspondence from international banking officials detailing massive, untraceable deposits. To make it completely irresistible, I locked the individual spreadsheets with a basic, easily bypassable encryption. It had to look authentic enough to spark his greed, but vulnerable enough to make him think he was a genius for hacking it. I placed the folder dead center on the digital desktop background, right over a picture of Diane and me in our younger years. It felt like a desecration, but it was a necessary evil to catch her tormentors. I left the folder completely visible. I disabled the automatic sleep function on the laptop, ensuring the screen would remain glowing and active, a digital beacon in the dim light of the study. I turned up the screen brightness to its absolute maximum. It was the perfect illusion of an old man who had forgotten to close his most sensitive files before wandering off in a fog of dementia. I stood back and surveyed the room. The desk looked appropriately cluttered. The bait was set. The witnesses were rolling. Now I just had to wait for the rats to return to the maze I had built for them. I grabbed a thick wool blanket from the hall closet and walked out onto the back porch. The afternoon air was bitterly cold, carrying the heavy threat of an approaching winter storm. I sank into my old wooden rocking chair, wrapping the heavy blanket tightly around my shoulders to ward off the freezing wind. I pulled my hat down low over my eyes and rested my hands softly in my lap. I slowed my breathing, letting my chest rise and fall in the slow, rhythmic cadence of a deep, oblivious slumber. To anyone looking through the window, I was just a tired, broken old man dreaming of his lost wife. But underneath the heavy wool blanket, my right hand was resting firmly in my pocket, my thumb hovering over the cold glass of the hidden burner phone waiting for the digital notification that would signal the beginning of their absolute ruin. The hunt had finally moved into its final phase. I was completely ready. I sat motionless in the rocking chair, letting the freezing wind whip across the porch. The heavy wool blanket offered little physical warmth, but the absolute certainty of my impending victory insulated me against the bitter cold. I maintained the slow, shallow breathing of a sleeping elder, my head tilted forward, my eyes closed just enough to feign unconsciousness, while still tracking the long shadows stretching across the gravel driveway. For nearly 2 hours, the only sounds were the howling wind and the distant, lonely call of a winter bird. Then deep inside the lining of my coat pocket, the cheap plastic burner phone vibrated. It was a single, sharp pulse. Veronica had delivered. I waited for another minute, scanning the perimeter to ensure I was entirely alone. Satisfied that nobody was watching, I slipped my hand beneath the thick blanket and retrieved the device. I unlocked the screen and opened the encrypted messaging application. Veronica had sent a massive, heavily encrypted digital dossier. The download progress bar crept across the tiny screen, each pixel representing a terrifying truth about the man sleeping under my roof. When the file finally opened, I began to read. Trent Lawson had spent the last 5 years aggressively cultivating the image of a brilliant, untouchable financial savant. He drove a customized luxury vehicle, wore bespoke Italian suits, and threw around complex investment terminology at every family gathering. He presented himself as a master of the modern market, a day trader who outsmarted the traditional banking institutions at every turn. The dossier exposed that carefully constructed facade for exactly what it was: a complete, desperate, hollow illusion. Trent was not a financial genius. He was a degenerate gambling addict. The spreadsheets Veronica had extracted from his hidden accounts painted a picture of absolute catastrophic ruin. He had not been investing in emerging tech markets or stable foreign currency exchanges. He had been funneling millions of dollars through offshore online casinos, illegal sports betting syndicates, and high-stakes underground poker games. The losses were staggering. I scrolled down the small screen, watching his net worth plummet over the years, evaporating into nothingness. He had drained his own savings, quietly liquidated his retirement portfolios, and quietly remortgaged every asset he possessed. But the most horrifying revelation was waiting at the bottom of the 4th page. Trent had not simply gone broke. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. When the legitimate credit lines had dried up, he had turned to the shadows. Veronica had traced a series of massive undocumented cash injections into his accounts over the past 8 months. The money had originated from a shell corporation tied directly to a notoriously violent loan shark syndicate operating out of Chicago. Trent had borrowed $5 million in dirty money to chase his staggering losses, desperately hoping for a miraculous payout that would magically erase his catastrophic mistakes. The payout never came. Instead, he had lost every single penny of the syndicate's money. The encrypted communications Veronica intercepted between Trent and his handlers in Chicago were chilling. The men he owed were not traditional bankers who would simply repossess his luxury car and ruin his credit score. They were ruthless, brutal enforcers who dealt in broken bones and disappeared bodies. The tone of the messages sent to Trent over the last 3 weeks had shifted from aggressive collection demands to explicit graphic threats of violence against him and his wife. The syndicate had given him a hard, absolute deadline. The entire $5 million debt had to be paid in full by next Friday. If the money did not materialize by the deadline, Trent was a dead man. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with terrifying clarity. The staged gas leak in the kitchen, the theatrical display of daughterly panic, the pre-filled involuntary psychiatric commitment form hidden in his leather briefcase. It was never about a slow, creeping greed. It was about sheer, unadulterated survival. Trent and Valerie were drowning, and they had decided to use my lifeless body as a raft. They needed to seize control of my assets instantly. If they could successfully convince a state-appointed medical board that I was suffering from severe dangerous dementia, Valerie would be granted immediate emergency conservatorship. She would have the total legal authority to bypass my trusts, shatter my financial protections, and access the capital they desperately required to save their own lives. Veronica had uncovered one final devastating piece of evidence that solidified the sheer depth of their depravity. Trent had not just planned to drain my liquid cash reserves. He had already taken steps to liquidate my entire estate. Attached to the bottom of the dossier was a digital listing from a restricted shadow real estate network. These were private, unlisted property exchanges designed for rapid, unquestioned transactions between wealthy individuals who preferred to operate outside the traditional regulated housing market. My home, the beautiful, sprawling Bucks County sanctuary that Diane and I had spent 30 years restoring, was actively listed for sale. Trent had uploaded comprehensive photographs, structural blueprints, and detailed property appraisals. He had set the asking price at a significant, desperate discount to ensure an immediate cash-only transaction. The listing explicitly stated that the property would be fully available for transfer by next weekend, perfectly aligning with the Loan Shark Syndicate's deadline. He was planning to sell my home out from under me the very second the asylum doors locked behind my back. I locked the burner phone and slipped it back into my pocket, gripping the armrests of my rocking chair. The cold wind biting at my face felt completely insignificant compared to the absolute freezing terror settling into my bones. Desperation breeds a unique kind of monster. A greedy man might wait for his victim to pass away naturally. A desperate man, a man whose own life is actively measured in days, will not hesitate to force the issue. Trent was backed into a lethal corner by violent men, and he had absolutely nothing left to lose. I had assumed I was simply dealing with arrogant, entitled children trying to trick an old man out of his inheritance. I was completely wrong. I was dealing with a cornered, terrified animal who would readily commit murder to save his own skin. If the staged gas leak failed to secure my commitment, I knew with absolute certainty that their next attempt would be infinitely more direct and infinitely more fatal. They were running out of time, and that made them the most dangerous creatures on Earth. I could not just play defense anymore. I had to strike back before Friday. I refused to let my own daughter sacrifice my life to save a degenerate gambler. The trap I had just laid in the study with the fake offshore accounts was no longer just a simple test of their greed. It was a critical instrument of psychological warfare. I sat quietly in the freezing chill, staring down the driveway, completely ready for the violent storm approaching my doorstep. I would not let them win. I was completely prepared to do absolutely whatever it took to completely destroy them. The freezing wind howled across the wooden floorboards of the back porch, cutting through the heavy wool blanket wrapped tightly around my shoulders. I sat motionless in the antique rocking chair, staring out at the frost-covered lawn. My fingers remained perfectly still inside my deep coat pocket, resting gently against the cold plastic casing of the prepaid burner phone. I was no longer the confused, grieving widower they believed me to be. I was a hunter, waiting patiently in the blind, completely aware that the predators I was tracking were currently living inside my own home. For 45 agonizing minutes, the world was reduced to the sound of my own steady breathing and the distant rustle of barren oak branches. The afternoon sun began its slow descent behind the tree line, casting long, dark shadows across the estate. Then it happened. The burner phone vibrated against my thigh. It was not a phone call. It was a single, sharp, sustained pulse indicating a high-priority alert from the secure application Veronica had installed. The motion sensor on the micro camera hidden inside the study smoke detector had been triggered. I slowly withdrew my hand from my pocket, shielding the bright screen from the fading daylight. I unlocked the device with a swipe of my thumb and opened the encrypted surveillance feed. The high-definition video buffered for a fraction of a second before snapping into perfect crystalline clarity. My pulse quickened, but my breathing remained completely controlled. The digital trap had been sprung. Through the small screen, I watched the heavy oak door of my study slowly swing open. The hallway light spilled across the Persian rug. Trent stepped into the room first, his head swiveling side to side as he scanned the shadows. He was still wearing the expensive tailored suit from his fictitious wine-tasting event, though he had loosened his silk tie, revealing the frantic, nervous energy pulsing just beneath his polished exterior. Valerie followed closely behind him, clutching a thick cashmere shawl around her shoulders. She carefully pushed the door shut, leaving it open just a fraction of an inch to listen for my footsteps. They moved with the hurried, synchronized precision of thieves who had rehearsed this exact scenario. Trent rushed straight toward my heavy mahogany desk. He did not bother checking the antique floor safe this time. The glowing screen of my open laptop commanded his entire attention. The brightly lit digital folder, explicitly labeled Offshore Trust Fund $10 million, was sitting dead center on the desktop, practically begging to be opened. Trent let out a sharp, breathless gasp. He leaned over the desk, his eyes widening with unfiltered greed as he read the title. He reached into his suit jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek black USB thumb drive. It was a brute force decryption tool, the kind of illegal software designed to shatter basic passwords and strip files bare. He aggressively jammed the metal connector into the side port of my laptop. His fingers flew across the keyboard, typing rapid commands to initiate the hacking sequence. I pressed the speaker of the burner phone closer to my ear, straining to catch every sound picked up by the sensitive, hidden microphone. Valerie paced nervously behind him, biting her lower lip, her eyes darting between the glowing computer screen and the slightly open doorway. "Is it working?" she asked, her voice tight with anticipation. "Can you get past the encryption wall?" Trent did not look up from the screen. "Give me a minute, Val," he muttered, his tone dripping with condescension. The old man used a standard alphanumeric lock. "It is pathetic. The extraction software is already chewing through the firewall. It is just a matter of processing power now. We are going to bleed this hidden account completely dry." Valerie stopped pacing. She stepped closer to the desk, resting her hands on the back of his leather chair. Her face, usually so composed and socially manufactured, twisted into a mask of pure, ugly avarice. "If we crack this today, we do not even need to wait for the shadow real estate broker to sell the house," she whispered, her voice carrying a venomous, excited edge. "We just wire the liquid cash directly into the shell accounts in Panama. Once the transfer clears, we dump him at Shady Pines tomorrow morning. We hand the keys to the bank and walk away with $10 million in clean, untraceable capital. Nobody will ever believe a raving, demented old man complaining about stolen funds. It is absolutely foolproof, Trent. We will be free." The words hit me with the physical force of a sledgehammer to the chest. I sat frozen on the freezing porch, staring down at the tiny screen in absolute silence. For the past 24 hours, I had fought desperately to convince myself that Trent was the sole architect of this nightmare. I had clung to the fragile, desperate hope that my daughter was simply a pawn, manipulated and coerced by a desperate, violent man drowning in mob debt. I wanted to believe that somewhere beneath her cold exterior, the little girl I had raised still existed, trapped and terrified. But the sheer, unadulterated greed vibrating in her voice shattered that illusion into a million irreparable pieces. She was not a victim. She was an active, enthusiastic architect of my destruction. She was fully prepared to lock me inside an underfunded abusive asylum, stripping away my freedom and my dignity, just to steal a fortune she had not earned. She was willing to condemn her own father to a living death, so she could finance her luxury vacations and escape the consequences of her husband's catastrophic gambling addiction. The pain of that realization was deeper than the grief of losing Diane. Diane had been taken by a cruel, random act of nature. Valerie was choosing to destroy me with cold, calculated malice. The love I had harbored for her, the protective instinct that had defined my life for nearly 4 decades, withered and died in the freezing afternoon air. It was replaced by a vast, hollow emptiness, followed immediately by a surge of pure, unyielding resolve. I watched the screen as the progress bar on Trent's decryption software inched toward 100%. He leaned forward, an arrogant smirk spreading across his face, ready to claim his stolen prize. But the folder I had created was not a simple vault. It was a digital labyrinth designed to waste his precious time. The software chimed, signaling a successful breach, but as Trent opened the primary spreadsheet, his smile vanished. Instead of routing numbers and account balances, the screen filled with endless rows of randomized, encrypted, alphanumeric junk data. "What is this?" he hissed, slamming his fist against the mahogany desk. "This is garbage. Where are the numbers?" The panic returned to his voice, shrill and desperate. The mob's deadline was ticking closer, and his $10 million lifeline had just dissolved into digital dust. Valerie gasped. I lowered the burner phone and placed it back into my pocket. I took a breath, inhaling the air. I pushed myself up. It was time. I pushed myself up from the freezing porch and stepped back into the warmth of the house, letting the heavy oak door click shut behind me. The winter storm had finally broken, lashing against the thick window panes with a violent, rhythmic fury. The evening shadows stretched long and thin across the living room floor. I settled into my worn leather armchair by the unlit fireplace, pulling the thick wool blanket up to my chest. I stared at the dark, empty hearth, letting my expression go completely slack, playing the part of the exhausted, declining elder. My heart, however, was beating with the steady, calculated rhythm of a seasoned prosecutor preparing for the final days of a trial. The sound of soft, deliberately measured footsteps pulled me from my thoughts. Valerie walked into the living room carrying a steaming ceramic mug. The scent of bitter herbs and aggressively sweet honey cut through the stale air of the house. She moved with a practiced feline grace, stopping right beside my armchair. Her face was arranged into a mask of pure angelic concern, a terrifying contrast to the venomous greed I had heard in her voice just a few hours earlier. "Dad," she said softly, her voice dripping with an artificial saccharine sweetness that made my skin crawl. "You look so tired tonight. I made you some of that herbal chamomile tea." I brought the mug closer, wrapping my cold fingers around the warm ceramic. I stared down at the dark, murky liquid. It smelled wrong. Beneath the overpowering scent of chamomile and honey, there was a faint, sharp chemical undertone. It was the smell of a crushed bitter powder hastily dissolved in hot water. "Drink this," Dad Valerie urged, leaning down to place a gentle hand on my shoulder. I added some special natural supplements to it. "The doctor said they will really help clear your brain fog and help you get a deep, restful sleep. You need to rest your mind." My gut screamed at me. Every instinct I possessed, honed over decades of reading criminals and liars, flared with absolute certainty. The tea was spiked. It was heavily dosed with whatever powerful sedatives they had managed to procure, designed to keep me completely incapacitated while they executed their final desperate maneuvers. If I drank that liquid, I would wake up locked inside the sterile padded walls of Shady Pines mental facility. I needed a distraction, and I needed it immediately. I raised the mug halfway to my lips, letting my hand tremble violently. Suddenly, I inhaled sharply and threw my head forward, launching into a severe, racking coughing fit. I hacked loudly, my chest heaving, spilling a few drops of the hot tea onto my lap. I brought my free hand to my mouth, gasping for air, making a wet, choking sound deep in my throat. "Oh my goodness," Valerie exclaimed, stepping back quickly to avoid the splashing liquid. "Dad, hold on. Let me get you a napkin and some cold water. Just breathe." She turned on her heel and rushed toward the kitchen. The moment her back disappeared around the corner of the hallway, I moved with absolute terrifying speed. I leaned over the armrest of my chair and tipped the ceramic mug over the large, decorative, potted Boston fern resting on the floor beside me. The hot, chemically laced liquid vanished instantly into the dark, thirsty soil. I shook the last few drops from the rim, sat back up, and pressed the rim of the empty mug against my bottom lip. I wiped my mouth with the back of my trembling hand, just as Valerie hurried back into the living room, clutching a fistful of paper towels. "Are you all right?" she asked, her eyes darting suspiciously to the mug. I let out a weak, rattling sigh and offered her a frail smile. "Yes, sweetheart," I murmured, my voice appropriately raspy. It just went down the wrong pipe. But I finished it all. It was very good. "Thank you for taking such good care of me." Valerie took the empty mug from my hands, a subtle gleam of dark triumph flashing across her eyes. "You are very welcome, Dad. Just close your eyes now. Let the supplements do their work." She walked away, taking her victory back to the kitchen. I settled deep into the leather cushions, preparing for the most difficult performance of the night. I slowed my breathing, extending my inhales and exhales until they formed a deep, rhythmic pattern. I let my jaw go completely slack, dropping my chin toward my chest. I relaxed every muscle in my body, forcing the tension out of my arms and legs. To anyone watching, I was an old man slipping into a heavy drug-induced coma. 10 minutes passed in absolute silence. The house was so quiet I could hear the rain pelting the glass and the wind howling through the eaves. Then the floorboards in the hallway creaked. Heavy, deliberate footsteps approached the living room. It was Trent, followed closely by Valerie. They did not bother tiptoeing. They walked straight into the room and stopped directly in front of my chair. I kept my eyes closed, narrowing my vision to a tiny, imperceptible slit beneath my eyelashes. I could see the polished tips of Trent's expensive leather shoes standing just inches from my boots. "Is he out?" Trent asked, his voice entirely devoid of the fake affection he normally used around me. "He drank the whole thing," Valerie replied coldly. "That was a double dose of the liquid lorazepam. He should be out cold until tomorrow afternoon." Trent did not simply take her word for it. He stepped closer and drew his leg back. He swung his foot forward, kicking the thick leather toe of my winter boot. It was a hard, aggressive strike, completely devoid of any hesitation. The impact jolted my leg, sending a sharp spike of pain up my shin. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to jump up and wrap my hands around his arrogant throat. But I remained perfectly still. I did not flinch. I did not alter the slow, heavy rhythm of my breathing. I hung there like a rag doll. "Yeah, he is gone," Trent muttered, letting out a heavy sigh of relief. "All right, we do not have time to waste." The hacker software could not break his ridiculous encrypted folders on the laptop. That means the hard copies have to be hidden somewhere in this room. He has always been a dinosaur about his finances. He keeps paper trails for everything. We need the physical bank statements, the routing numbers, and the master key to that iron safe. Valerie moved immediately. "Start with the bookshelves," she commanded, her voice sharp and businesslike. "Pull every book out. Check the hollow bindings. I will tear apart the filing cabinets." For the next hour, I sat motionless in the center of the living room, a ghost in my own home, while my daughter and her husband systematically dismantled my life. They moved like a pack of starving wolves tearing into a carcass. Books were ripped from the mahogany shelves and thrown carelessly onto the floor. Drawers were yanked open, their contents dumped unceremoniously onto the expensive Persian rug. They shattered decorative vases, sliced open the backing of framed family photographs, and rummaged through Diane's collection of antique sheet music. The sheer disrespect was breathtaking. They stepped over my outstretched legs, tossing discarded papers right onto my lap, treating me as if I were already dead and buried. "Where is it?" Trent hissed, his breath ragged as he forcefully overturned a heavy leather ottoman. "He cannot have hidden everything. He is a declining old fool." "Keep looking," Valerie snapped back, her hands frantically sorting through a pile of my old legal briefs. "We have to find those routing numbers before Friday. If we do not transfer the cash before we drop him at the asylum, the mob will take our house, Trent. They will take everything. We have to find the physical ledger." I listened to the desperation dripping from my daughter's words. I listened to the sound of my history being destroyed piece by piece. But the pain of betrayal had finally burned away, leaving behind a cold, indestructible armor. They thought they were hunting me. They thought they were stripping me of my resources. They had absolutely no idea that every movement, every desperate threat, and every shattered vase was being captured in high definition by the tiny hidden camera mounted directly above their heads. The trap had closed seamlessly around them. They were digging their own graves, completely blind to the fact that I was watching them throw the dirt. I quietly watched the tiny screen of my prepaid burner phone as Trent and Valerie finally abandoned their destructive search of my living room. They stood amidst the ruined photographs and scattered books, their chests heaving with frustrated exhaustion. Trent kicked a leather-bound volume across the Persian rug, muttering a string of violent curses into the quiet room. Valerie rubbed her temples, her face pale and drawn, completely devoid of the sweet facade she wore whenever she knew I was watching. They had failed to find the hidden bank ledgers they desperately needed to secure their financial salvation. I listened to their defeated footsteps retreating up the main staircase, waiting until the distinct sound of their bedroom door slamming shut echoed through the storm-battered house. I was alone again, sitting in the freezing darkness of the back porch. The winter storm had rapidly intensified the wind, driving rain against the wooden slats, but I barely felt the biting cold. My mind was consumed by the stark reality of the war being waged inside my own home. Suddenly, the cheap plastic casing of the cellular device vibrated sharply against my palm. It was another encrypted transmission from Veronica. The brightly lit screen illuminated my weathered face in the dark. The urgent digital message contained a single heavily compressed encrypted attachment and a brief urgent string of text. The text read, "Caldwell. I dug past the casino ledgers. I found his final contingency plan. It is a medical extraction. Look at the date. Open the file immediately." My thumb hovered over the screen. I tapped the attachment, waiting for the decryption software to unpack the data. It was a newly intercepted, highly sensitive email exchange routed through a series of anonymous, untraceable servers that Trent had foolishly believed were completely secure. The emails were sent between my son-in-law and a man named Dr. Elias Vance. The name triggered a faint, distant memory from my days in the prosecutor's office. Vance was a disgraced, unlicensed physician, a man who had been quietly stripped of his medical credentials years ago for running a clandestine prescription mill. He was a ghost in the medical community, a shadow who sold his signature to the highest bidder without asking any questions. The email thread detailed a cold, purely transactional arrangement. Trent had initiated contact 2 weeks ago, explaining that he required an ironclad, unchallengeable medical evaluation for a difficult elderly relative. Vance had replied with a single exorbitant price tag, $20,000 wired directly to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Veronica had intercepted the digital receipt, confirming the transfer had cleared just 3 days ago. I scrolled down to the bottom of the email chain. Attached to the final message was a high-definition PDF document. I opened it. It was a formal, legally binding medical affidavit bearing the official seal of the State Health Department. The words on the small screen blurred for a moment as my eyes struggled to process the sheer audacity of the betrayal. The document was a comprehensive, devastating psychological evaluation. It detailed a rapid cognitive decline. It documented imaginary instances of violent outbursts and a complete detachment from reality. According to the medical record, I was incapable of managing my own basic needs. The concluding paragraph was written in stark terminology. It declared Harrison Caldwell to be severely non-compos mentis, a legal designation of mental incompetence. The doctor recommended immediate involuntary psychiatric commitment to a secure facility for my own physical safety. I stared at the glowing screen, my breath catching in my throat. Dr. Elias Vance had never stepped foot inside my home. He had never taken my blood pressure, never looked into my eyes, never asked me a single question. Yet for the price of $20,000 in bribe money, he had legally assassinated me. He had effectively erased my autonomy, reducing a lifetime of sharp, clear memories and legal rights into a single piece of forged paper. But the most terrifying detail was not the horrific medical diagnosis. It was the timestamp printed neatly at the top of the official document. Veronica had explicitly told me to look at the date. I zoomed in on the top right corner of the PDF. The medical affidavit was post-dated. It was dated for the upcoming Wednesday. Today was Monday evening. A cold wave of understanding washed over me. I had assumed the Loan Shark Syndicate's Friday deadline was the ticking clock I had to beat. I was horribly wrong. Trent and Valerie were not going to wait until the end of the week. They were not waiting for my mental state to naturally decline, and they were certainly not relying on a staged kitchen fire to get the job done. They were actively manufacturing my legal death, and they were executing the final phase in less than 48 hours. By Wednesday morning, they would submit this forged affidavit to a sympathetic or bribed judge. With Valerie's signature as my primary caregiver, the emergency conservatorship would be granted instantly. They would not gently escort me to a nursing home. They would call the authorities. Orderlies from the Shady Pines mental facility would arrive at my front door with an ambulance. They would drag me out of my home in a straitjacket. And the terrible reality of their plan was that any resistance I offered, any shouting, any claims of fraud, would only serve to validate the forged medical report. The harder I fought to prove my sanity, the crazier I would appear. Once the heavy steel doors of the asylum locked behind me, Valerie would have immediate access to every bank account, every trust fund, and every property deed in my name. I sat in the rocking chair, the bitter cold finally penetrating my thick wool coat. My own flesh and blood had put a price tag on my freedom. Valerie was willing to let me rot, in a chemically induced stupor, in a derelict state-run asylum, just to save a man who had squandered their life on illegal poker games and sports bets. The profound depth of her malice extinguished any remaining flicker of paternal mercy I possessed. There would be no tearful confrontation. There would be no dramatic apology. They had chosen total, absolute warfare. I slowly turned off the prepaid burner phone and placed it very carefully back into my deep coat pocket. I slowly stood up, my joints aching, my muscles stiff from the freezing winter temperature. The doddering, completely helpless old man who had sat down in this chair an hour ago was dead. The seasoned prosecutor, the man who had spent 3 decades meticulously destroying the lives of arrogant criminals, had returned. I had less than 48 hours to dismantle an airtight legal trap, protect my fortune, and sever the jaws of the trap they had so carefully laid. The hunt was no longer just about gathering evidence. It was about execution. I pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders and walked back into the dark, quiet house, ready to completely burn their perfectly constructed nightmare to the absolute barren ground without hesitation. I spent the remainder of the night in a state of hypervigilance. I lay in the darkness of my bedroom, listening to the heavy rain batter the window panes, calculating every possible variable. The revelation of the forged medical affidavit had shifted the timeline dramatically. I was no longer fighting a slow war of attrition. I was fighting a countdown that expired on Wednesday morning. As the first pale light of dawn began to bleed through the heavy curtains, I knew I could not stay inside the house. The physical proximity to my betrayers was clouding my focus. I needed absolute isolation to monitor the digital traps I had laid. I dressed quietly, bypassing my usual heavy winter coat for a faded insulated canvas jacket. I bypassed the luxury sedan sitting in the pristine garage. Instead, I reached for a set of tarnished keys hanging on a rusted nail near the mudroom door. They belonged to my old battered pickup truck, a reliable machine I kept parked behind the carriage house for hauling firewood and garden supplies. It was freezing, unassuming, and completely off their radar. I slipped out the side door, ignoring the stinging chill of the morning frost. The heavy tires of the old truck crunched softly against the gravel as I settled into the cracked vinyl driver's seat. I did not turn the key in the ignition. The roar of the engine would alert them to my presence. Instead, I wrapped my cold hands around the steering wheel and pulled the prepaid burner phone from my pocket. My breath plumed in the freezing cabin air as I tapped the screen, opening the encrypted surveillance application Veronica had provided. The 3 camera feeds instantly populated the small screen. The living room was empty. The study was empty. But the camera mounted above the kitchen island showed movement. I tapped the specific feed, expanding it to fill the entire screen and maximized the audio volume. Trent was pacing furiously across the expensive imported tile. The slick, arrogant financier from the previous night had completely vanished. In his place was a frantic, cornered man coming apart at the seams. His tie was draped loosely around his neck, and his dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. He ran his hands through his perfectly styled hair, ruining the expensive cut, muttering rapid, incoherent curses under his breath. He looked at his smartphone every 5 seconds, his eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic terror. The loan shark syndicate in Chicago was clearly tightening the leash. He walked to the marble counter, poured a glass of cold water, and drank it in one long, desperate gulp. His hands were shaking so violently that the heavy glass rattled against his teeth. Valerie walked into the frame completely put together in a sharp, tailored morning dress. She moved with an eerie, disconnected calmness, pulling a carton of almond milk from the refrigerator. She watched her husband unravel with an expression of mild annoyance, as if his mortal terror was merely a frustrating inconvenience to her morning routine. "You need to calm down, Trent," Valerie said smoothly, pouring the milk into a ceramic bowl. "You are going to give yourself a heart attack before we even get the money transferred. Calm down," Trent hissed, spinning around to face her. The panic in his voice was thick and sharp. "How am I supposed to calm down, Valerie? The men in Chicago are not sending polite collection letters. They sent me a photograph of a man missing 3 fingers this morning. They said I am next if the 5 million does not hit their routing number by Friday. We are out of time, though." "We have the forged affidavit," Valerie replied, her voice remaining perfectly level, completely devoid of empathy. "The asylum orderlies will be here first thing Wednesday morning. Once they haul him away and lock him in the psychiatric ward, the conservatorship triggers automatically. We will have total unrestricted access to the liquid assets by Wednesday afternoon. We will wire the 5 million to Chicago and use the rest to disappear. The plan is flawless." "It is not flawless," Trent fired back, slamming his hand against the granite countertop. The loud smack echoed through the tiny speaker of my phone. He pointed a trembling finger at the ceiling, gesturing toward my bedroom upstairs. "The old man is not a vegetable. He has moments where he looks right through me, but he is still sharp. What if the doctor at Shady Pines actually evaluates him? What if they ask him basic questions and he answers them perfectly? What if he speaks clearly to the intake judge and proves he is completely sane? A fake piece of paper from a disgraced, bribed doctor is not going to hold up if Harrison stands there and articulates a coherent legal defense. If they deny the commitment order, the conservatorship fails. If the conservatorship fails, we do not get the cash. And if we do not get the cash, I am a dead man." Trent leaned over the island, his chest heaving. His fear was completely justified. The forged document was a gamble, a desperate play relying entirely on the assumption that a state-run facility would be too overcrowded and underfunded to properly verify the diagnosis. If anyone bothered to actually test my cognitive functions, the entire house of cards would violently collapse. Valerie stood frozen for a long moment. She slowly placed the carton of almond milk down on the counter. The mask of the patient calculating wife began to slip, revealing the terrifying, cold-blooded monster hiding just beneath the surface. I watched her perfectly manicured fingers curl into tight fists. She picked up the heavy water glass Trent had just discarded. With a sudden explosive motion, she slammed the heavy bottom of the glass down onto the granite counter. The sharp, violent crack of the impact made me jump inside the freezing truck cabin. "Then we do not let him speak," Valerie snarled. Her voice was no longer smooth or patronizing. It had dropped into a low, demonic register that I had never heard before. It was a sound completely devoid of humanity. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated malice. Trent stopped pacing. He stared at his wife, his mouth slightly open, clearly shocked by the sheer venom radiating from her. "I am sick and tired of playing the caring, devoted daughter," Valerie continued her words, clipping the air like heavy shears. "I am exhausted from walking on eggshells, pouring him tea, and waiting for nature to run its miserable, slow course. We do not have the luxury of hoping a bribed intake nurse looks the other way. We cannot afford to let him walk into that asylum with a functioning vocal cord. If his voice is the only thing standing between us and $10 million, then we permanently remove his ability to use it. Trent swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. What are you saying, Val? What are you actually proposing we do? We cannot just silence him in front of the medical transport team. We do not do it in front of them, Valerie whispered, leaning closer to him. We do it before they arrive. We stop waiting for the forged papers to do the heavy lifting. We take absolute control of the situation tonight. Let us just handle him exactly how we handled Mom. I stopped breathing. The freezing air inside the truck cabin felt like solid ice pressing against my chest. My fingers clamped around the small plastic phone with bone-crushing force. The audio feed continued to hum with the ambient noise of the kitchen, but I could no longer hear the refrigerator running or the wind rattling the window panes. The entire world had narrowed down to those 6 horrific, devastating words. Exactly how we handled Mom. For 5 years, I had mourned Diane. I had stood by her hospital bed holding her cold, lifeless hand, believing with every fiber of my being that a sudden, tragic, massive stroke had stolen her away from me. I had trusted the doctors. I had trusted the devastating randomness of human biology. I had spent countless lonely nights staring at her empty pillow, completely consumed by the unbearable, heavy grief of a natural tragedy. But it was not a tragedy. It was not a random stroke. I stared at the tiny screen, watching my daughter's cold, dead eyes as she looked at her husband. The truth washed over me in a suffocating, paralyzing wave of absolute horror. Diane did not just die. They murdered her. "Keep your voice down," Trent hissed, his panic cutting through the tiny speaker. His heavy footsteps echoed across the kitchen. "Are you out of your mind, Valerie? You do not ever talk about that. Not here, not anywhere. The walls have ears, and we are already walking on a razor-thin wire." Valerie let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. "Oh, please," she sneered, her voice dripping with absolute contempt. "Who is going to hear us, Trent? The storm outside is drowning out everything else. Stop acting like a terrified child and listen to me. We are going to lose everything if we do not take absolute control right now." "You are talking about murder, Trent," whispered his voice, trembling with fear and cowardly compliance. "I am talking about survival," Valerie snapped back. Her footsteps clicked against the tile floor as she paced. "It is exactly what we did 2 years ago. Do not stand there and pretend you do not remember, Trent. Do not pretend you were not standing right beside me the entire time." My breath caught in my throat, but the audio feed was relentlessly clear. She was going to give it all away. Valerie continued, her tone shifting from anger to a chilling, rational justification. "You saw the documents on her desk that morning. Mom was going to rewrite her will and funnel 70% of our liquid cash into that pathetic children's hospital foundation. 70%, Trent. Millions of dollars gone just so she could feel like a saint. We had to stop her." I remember Trent muttered weakly. Then remember how easy it was. She pushed her voice, lowering into a conspiratorial whisper. She grabbed her chest. She said she felt a tightness, a pain radiating down her arm. It was a mild cardiac event, a warning sign. All she needed was her nitroglycerin pills from the bathroom cabinet. She looked right at me, Trent. She looked right at her only daughter and begged me to get her medicine. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the kitchen. My beautiful, vibrant Diane suffering in our bedroom, looking to our child for salvation. I walked to the bathroom, Valerie said, her voice completely devoid of any human emotion. I opened the cabinet. I held the orange plastic bottle in my hand. And then I looked at you, standing in the hallway. We both knew what was going to happen if she lived to sign those papers the next morning. So I put the bottle back on the shelf. I walked out of the bedroom. I pulled the heavy oak door shut behind me, and I turned the lock. My chest heaved. "She knocked," Trent whispered, his voice cracking with the memory. "She weakly knocked on the door. She knocked for exactly 4 minutes. Valerie corrected him coldly. "She knocked and she wheezed and she asked why the door was locked. She gasped for air like a fish on a dock. And we stood there in the hallway, holding our breath, listening to her choke, until there was absolutely nothing left but silence. And then we waited another 30 minutes just to be absolutely certain. We unlocked the door, we staged her body on the floor to make it look like a sudden massive collapse, and we called the paramedics. It was clean, it was effective, it was necessary, and it worked perfectly. The burner phone slipped from my numb fingers. It clattered against the rubber floor mat of the truck, the audio feed still broadcasting Valerie's monstrous rationalizations. But I was no longer listening to her. I was trapped in a suffocating void of pure, unadulterated agony. I collapsed forward, my forehead crashing heavily against the cold, hard plastic of the steering wheel. The dam I had built around my emotions finally broke. The burning tears came not as a gentle release, but as a violently explosive physical eruption. I cried for my wife. I cried for the terrifying, lonely pain she must have felt in those final 4 minutes, locked inside her own sanctuary, betrayed by the child she had carried, nurtured, and loved with every ounce of her soul. The image burned itself into my mind. Diane, terrified, clutching her chest, leaning against the heavy wood, listening to the silence on the other side of the door. They had murdered her. It was not a medical tragedy. It was a calculated, cold-blooded execution designed to protect their inheritance. They had watched her die, and then they had stood by me at her funeral, holding my hand, offering me words of comfort, while the dirt fell on her casket. For several minutes, the grief completely incapacitated me. I was a broken, weeping old man, shivering in a rusted truck too, completely crushed by the weight of an unimaginable betrayal. But as my tears fell onto the dusty steering column, something deep within the core of my being began to shift. The profound, paralyzing sorrow began to crystallize. The heat of the tears turned into a cold, absolute frost. I slowly lifted my head from the steering wheel. I wiped my face with the rough canvas sleeve of my jacket. I slowly inhaled a long, deep breath of the freezing winter air, letting it fill my lungs and steady my racing heart. I reached down to the floor mat and retrieved the burner phone. I muted the audio feed. I stared out through the rain-slicked windshield toward the dark silhouette of the estate. The grief was gone, replaced by a lethal, calculating fury that I had not felt in decades. It was the absolute, unyielding focus of a man who had spent 30 years as the most feared prosecutor in the state. I knew how to build a cage so tight that no lawyer, no bribe, and no amount of begging could pry it open. They thought they were dealing with a senile target. They thought they had successfully executed a perfect crime 2 years ago, and they believed they were about to pull off a second one. They had absolutely no idea that they had just handed the former Attorney General a full, uncoerced, digitally recorded confession to murder in the first degree. I sat in the dark, the engine still off, completely numb to the bitter cold. The plan I had originally formed was designed to expose a financial crime to protect my assets and to humiliate a greedy daughter and her desperate husband. That plan was now entirely obsolete. Financial ruin was a punishment reserved for thieves. Trent and Valerie were murderers. I locked the burner phone and carefully slipped it deep back into my coat pocket. My sharp mind began organizing the complex evidence, constructing the timeline, outlining the charges, and anticipating their defense. I had less than 48 hours before the fraudulent medical team arrived with their straitjacket. It was certainly more than enough time. They were going to lose the house and the stolen money, but more importantly, they were going to lose their freedom for the rest of their miserable lives. I reached out and rested my hand on the ignition key, ready to begin the final phase. The freezing night passed in a blur of cold calculation. I did not sleep a single wink. Instead, I spent the remaining hours in the darkness of my bedroom, mentally reviewing every piece of evidence, every legal precedent, and every procedural maneuver I would need to utterly annihilate them. When dawn finally broke, it painted the sky in a dull, bruised gray. It was the perfect backdrop for the performance I was about to deliver. I walked downstairs to the living room, moving with the stiff, painful gait of a man who had truly given up. I lowered myself into my leather armchair and waited. I did not wait long. At precisely 8, the heavy brass knocker on the front door pounded with aggressive authority. Before I could make a move to answer, the deadbolt clicked. Valerie had used her key. The heavy door swung open, hitting the wall with a loud, violent thud. She marched into the entryway, flanked by 2 towering, broad-shouldered court bailiffs. They wore dark uniforms and stern expressions, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts. They were men accustomed to dealing with unpredictable, dangerous situations. Valerie rushed into the center of the living room, stopping just a few feet from my armchair. Her performance was a masterpiece of theatrical deception. She clutched a thick stack of legal documents to her chest, her breathing shallow and ragged. Her face was flushed, and a pair of perfectly timed tears leaked from the corners of her eyes, tracing shiny paths down her cheeks. She looked exactly like a devastated, exhausted child making the hardest decision of her life. "Here he is, officers," Valerie said, her voice cracking with manufactured grief as she turned to face the 2 men. "My poor father. He is completely lost. He wanders the house at all hours, leaving the stove on, talking to people who are not there. It breaks my heart to see him like this, but he is a severe danger to himself. We have to go to court for an emergency hearing right now. The paperwork is all here." She extended her trembling hand, thrusting the documents toward the nearest bailiff. I recognized the thick, textured paper of the forged medical affidavit sitting on top of the stack, bearing the illegitimate signature of the disgraced physician. Right beneath it was the emergency petition for absolute conservatorship. The older bailiff took the paperwork, scanning the official seals with a practiced eye. He nodded sympathetically at Valerie before turning his attention to me. "Mr. Caldwell," the bailiff said, his tone a mixture of firm authority and gentle pity. "We have a court order here mandating your immediate presence for a psychiatric competency hearing. We need you to stand up and come with us peacefully. We do not want to use restraints, but we will if you make this difficult." I looked up at the 2 massive officers, letting my mouth fall open in a display of bewildered terror. Every instinct in my body, the muscle memory of an apex predator of the courtroom, screamed at me to stand tall, to demand their names, and to shred my daughter's fabricated narrative into dust. But a premature confrontation would ruin everything. If I fought back, if I raised my voice and cited legal statutes, I would simply validate the very insanity they were trying to prove. I needed to cross the threshold of that courthouse. I needed them to place me in front of a judge. That was where my power resided. So I swallowed my pride and leaned into the fiction. I blinked rapidly, allowing my hands to shake with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. I slowly gripped the armrests of my chair and pushed myself upward, letting my knees buckle just enough to appear incredibly frail. Valerie gasped, taking a dramatic step forward, as if she intended to catch me, but she strategically stopped, just short of making physical contact. "Okay," I murmured, my voice a weak, gravelly whisper. "Okay, I will go. Just please do not hurt me. I do not understand what is happening, but I will go." The younger bailiff relaxed his shoulders, clearly relieved that the extraction was not going to require physical force. "Sir, you need to put some shoes on the officer," instructed, pointing at my stocking feet. "And a jacket. It is freezing outside." I nodded submissively, keeping my chin tucked low against my chest. I shuffled past them with painfully small, dragging steps, making my way toward the mudroom at the back of the house. I ignored the pristine wool coats and polished leather dress shoes sitting in my closet. I needed to look the part of a neglected, declining invalid. I reached into the darkest corner of the wardrobe and pulled out my oldest, dirtiest flannel shirt. It was stained with grease and fraying at the collar. I pulled it over my shoulders, intentionally missing a button, to make myself look completely disheveled. Next, I reached down and picked up a pair of heavily scuffed, mud-caked gardening boots. I slipped them onto my feet, leaving the laces untied so they flopped loosely against the floorboards. I grabbed a battered, stained baseball cap and pulled it down low over my eyes, completing the pathetic transformation. I was no longer Harrison Caldwell, the formidable former Attorney General. I was a broken, defeated old man, mentally vacant, and completely incapable of caring for myself. I shuffled back into the living room, dragging the untied laces across the carpet. Trent had materialized while I was changing. He stood near the front door, leaning casually against the wall with his arms crossed over his chest. He was wearing a sharp, impeccably tailored navy suit, looking every bit the responsible, concerned son-in-law. But the moment the bailiffs turned their backs to guide me toward the exit, a sickening, triumphant smirk spread across his face. He pulled a sleek cellular phone from his inside pocket. His thumbs moved rapidly across the illuminated screen. He was not checking the weather. He was texting his handlers in the Loan Shark Syndicate, assuring the violent men in Chicago that the emergency conservatorship was in motion and their dirty money was finally guaranteed. I kept my head down, letting the bailiffs gently place their hands on my shoulders to guide me through the front door. The freezing morning wind hit my face, but the cold was nothing compared to the absolute ice flowing through my veins. Valerie followed closely behind us, her heels clicking a steady rhythm on the paved walkway, softly dabbing her dry eyes with a monogrammed tissue. They genuinely believed they had won. They thought they were leading a helpless sheep to the slaughterhouse, completely oblivious to the reality that they had just opened the gates for a starving wolf. I climbed into the back of the armored transport vehicle, clutching my dirty flannel shirt, knowing that my ultimate vengeance was finally within my immediate, devastating reach. Let them have their fleeting moment of arrogant victory today. I knew the truth. The absolute cold courthouse was waiting, and I was going to bury them both completely alive. The journey to the county courthouse in the back of the armored transport vehicle was brief and completely silent. The heavy metal doors swung open, and the freezing morning air rushed into the cramped space, biting at my exposed neck. The bailiffs guided me through the fortified rear entrance of the building, treating me with a delicate caution reserved for the frail and mentally broken. We navigated a labyrinth of sterile white hallways that smelled faintly of industrial floor cleaner and stale coffee. They led me into courtroom 4, a massive, imposing chamber constructed of dark oak and polished marble. I kept my head bowed as they directed me toward the defense table. I sank heavily into the hard wooden chair, letting my shoulders slump forward until my chest nearly touched the polished surface of the table. I gripped the brim of my battered, mud-stained baseball cap, with both hands twisting the worn fabric between my trembling fingers. I was sitting completely alone. There was no defense attorney by my side, no legal advocate to shield me from the impending slaughter. Across the center aisle, sitting at the pristine plaintiff table, were the architects of my orchestrated demise. Trent and Valerie looked like a picture of absolute devastating perfection. Trent sat tall and confident in his custom navy suit, exuding the false aura of a responsible, deeply concerned son. Valerie sat beside him wearing a conservative black dress that screamed of appropriate, dignified mourning for a father who was still breathing. Flanking them was their legal representation, a slick, high-priced attorney named Marcus Sterling. Sterling wore a $3,000 suit and possessed the oily, aggressive demeanor of a man who made his living exploiting legal loopholes and crushing the vulnerable. He was a ruthless mercenary. The heavy wooden door behind the bench swung open, and the bailiff instructed the room to rise. Judge Mitchell Weaver entered the courtroom. He was a stern, imposing figure with thinning gray hair and a sharp, deeply lined face that spoke of a career spent dealing with the absolute worst of human nature. Weaver was notorious in the legal community for his zero-tolerance policy regarding courtroom theatrics and his desire for maximum efficiency. He did not like wasting time, and he rarely looked deeply into emergency conservatorship petitions once a signed medical affidavit was placed on his desk. He took his seat behind the elevated mahogany bench, adjusted his reading glasses, and opened the thick manila folder containing my manufactured destruction. "You may proceed." Counselor Weaver stated, his voice a dry, impatient rumble that echoed through the cavernous room. Sterling stood up immediately, buttoning his suit jacket with a practiced, dramatic flourish. He walked to the center of the room, positioning himself perfectly to address both the judge and the gallery. Your Honor, we are here today regarding a profound and immediate family tragedy. Sterling began, his voice dripping with a carefully rehearsed, mournful cadence. My clients, Trent and Valerie Lawson, are seeking an emergency absolute conservatorship over the father of Valerie, Harrison Caldwell. Sterling gestured grandly toward my slumped, silent figure. It is with a heavy heart that we submit these documents today. Mr. Caldwell is suffering from a rapid, catastrophic cognitive decline. He has become completely detached from reality. He wanders his estate at all hours, speaking to people who do not exist and exhibiting sudden violent outbursts. He is unfortunately a very severe danger to himself and the public. We are requesting an involuntary commitment to a secure psychiatric care facility. Valerie buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking, as she released a series of loud, perfectly timed theatrical sobs. Trent wrapped a comforting arm around her, kissing the top of her head, while projecting a look of profound, solemn duty toward the bench. I kept my eyes focused firmly on the scuffed toes of my gardening boots, but I shifted my posture just a fraction of an inch to look beneath my arm. From that hidden vantage point, I saw the exact moment the grieving daughter facade slipped. Behind her hands, Valerie let out a quiet, cruel laugh. It was a triumphant, mocking smirk, a fleeting expression of malice directed entirely at my broken posture. She thought she had won. She thought the $10 million prize was finally secured, and the murder of her mother would remain buried forever. Sterling approached the bench, handing the bailiff the forged psychological evaluation. Your Honor, we have provided a legally binding affidavit from Dr. Elias Vance, a licensed psychiatric specialist who has thoroughly reviewed Mr. Caldwell's condition. The medical recommendation is clear and unambiguous. Mr. Caldwell is severely non-compos mentis. He lacks any capacity to manage his affairs. Judge Weaver took this document from the bailiff. He barely skimmed the first paragraph. I knew exactly how these emergency hearings operated. The system was severely overburdened. Judges were drowning in caseloads. When a reputable-looking family presented a properly formatted medical document bearing an official state seal, the courts almost always rubber-stamped the request to move the docket along. Weaver reached for the heavy brass pen resting on his desk. He uncapped it with a swift, practiced motion. He was prepared to blindly sign the order that would strip away my freedom and hand my fortune to murderers. We ask that the court grant full control of the estate and all financial trusts to my clients immediately, so they can properly fund his ongoing specialized medical care, Sterling concluded, returning to his seat with a look of supreme satisfaction. Trent tapped his fingers against the table, a nervous, greedy rhythm. Weaver hovered his pen over the signature line of the emergency petition. He paused. A slight frown creased his forehead. He flipped the page back, his eyes catching on the bold letters of my full legal name printed at the top of the forged psychiatric medical affidavit. Harrison Reginald Caldwell. Weaver slowly lowered the brass pen. The bored, impatient expression on his face completely vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp intensity. He looked up from the document. His gaze bypassed the slick attorney, completely ignored Trent, and swept right past the manufactured tears. Judge Mitchell Weaver looked directly at the defense table. He looked at the slumped, pathetic figure wearing a stained flannel shirt and mud-caked boots. The entire courtroom fell into an absolute suffocating silence. The ambient noise of the building seemed to completely evaporate. Weaver narrowed his eyes, staring with piercing, absolute focus. I stopped twisting the dirty baseball cap in my trembling hands. I slowly lifted my heavy chin from my chest. I rolled my stiff shoulders back, finally shedding the frail, defeated posture I had perfectly maintained all morning. I sat up perfectly straight, firmly planting my heavy boots on the polished floor. I raised my head up and met Judge Weaver's strict gaze dead on. Our eyes locked across the sterile room. I did not blink. I did not waver. I let the full, terrifying weight of my true identity radiate through my confident posture. I saw the exact moment the profound realization hit the stern man on the bench. Judge Mitchell Weaver stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. The heavy brass pen slipped from his frozen fingers, plummeting toward the mahogany desk and landing with a sharp, echoing clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the perfectly quiet room. The color drained from his face, leaving his stern features pale and completely slack. He was not looking at a pathetic, dementia-ridden patient in need of emergency institutionalization. He was looking at a ghost from his past, a man who had profoundly shaped the trajectory of his entire existence. 15 years ago, Mitchell Weaver had been a young, relentlessly ambitious municipal judge targeted by a deeply entrenched, violent political ring operating out of Chicago. They had tried to frame him for a series of horrific financial crimes he did not commit, planting fabricated evidence and threatening his family to force his immediate resignation. He had been hours away from losing his career, his freedom, and his life. But a powerful shadow-moving state attorney general had intervened. That attorney general had deployed his own specialized task force, bypassing the corrupt local precincts. He had systematically dismantled the political ring, buried the corrupt officials under airtight federal indictments, and completely exonerated the young judge without ever taking public credit. That ruthless, brilliant legal predator was Harrison Caldwell. Weaver gripped the edges of his elevated bench, leaning forward, as if the physical distance was playing tricks on his vision. The heavy formal silence of the courtroom stretched out, amplifying the mounting tension. Trent shifted uncomfortably in his expensive chair. His smug, victorious smile faltered, melting into an expression of profound confusion. He glanced sideways at Valerie, seeking some form of reassurance, but Valerie was completely paralyzed. Her perfectly manicured hands hovered in the air, her fake tears drying instantly on her cheeks. She looked back at her husband, her brow furrowed in utter bewilderment. Marcus Sterling, the sleazy, high-priced lawyer they had hired to orchestrate this execution, nervously cleared his throat, sensing that the procedural rubber stamp he had promised his clients had just evaporated into thin air. "My God!" Weaver whispered, his deep voice carrying clearly across the silent expanse of the courtroom. The microphone positioned on his desk picked up the raw, unfiltered shock, vibrating through every syllable. "Is it really you, Mr. Caldwell?" The question hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I let go of the filthy, mud-stained baseball cap I had been nervously twisting in my lap. I placed it deliberately onto the polished surface of the defense table. I placed my hands flat against the wood. My hands were no longer shaking. The violent, pathetic tremors I had flawlessly maintained all morning completely vanished. I gripped the edges of the table and pushed myself upward. I did not struggle. I did not stagger. I stood up with a smooth, fluid grace that absolutely betrayed my age. The stooped, hunchbacked posture I had worn like a heavy winter coat instantly evaporated. I rolled my shoulders back, lifting my chest, and aligning my spine until I stood at my full, imposing height. I reached up and unfastened the top button of the greasy, frayed flannel shirt, adjusting the collar with calm, deliberate precision. I turned my head, letting my gaze sweep slowly across the plaintiff table. I watched the arrogant confidence completely drain out of Trent Lawson. His mouth opened slightly, his eyes darting frantically as his brain desperately tried to process the physical transformation happening right in front of him. Valerie shrank back into her chair, her face contorting with a sudden instinctual terror. She finally recognized the terrifying absolute stillness in my posture. It was the same stillness I possessed right before I sent a convicted murderer to a maximum security penitentiary. My eyes hardened into polished steel, completely devoid of warmth, mercy, or parental affection. I looked past my betrayers and focused my attention directly onto the pale, shaken man sitting behind the judicial bench. "Yes, Mitchell," I replied. My voice was no longer a weak, gravelly whisper begging for compassion. It dropped into its natural commanding baritone, a powerful, resonant frequency that demanded absolute silence and total submission from everyone in the room. "It is me, and I will be representing myself today." Sterling immediately jumped to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floorboards. "Your Honor, I strongly object to this highly irregular proceeding," he sputtered, waving his hands in a frantic display of misplaced authority. The respondent has been legally diagnosed with severe cognitive decline by a licensed medical professional. He is entirely incapable of serving as his own legal counsel. This man is a danger to himself and cannot be permitted to commandeer a sensitive psychiatric hearing. Judge Weaver did not even blink at the attorney. He kept his eyes locked firmly on mine, a complex mixture of profound respect and dawning horror washing over his face. He slowly raised his hand, pointing a single rigid finger at the panicked lawyer. "Sit down." Counselor Weaver commanded, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. "You are currently standing in the presence of the most formidable legal mind this state has ever produced. If Harrison Caldwell states that he is representing himself, then Harrison Caldwell is representing himself. You will remain completely silent until you are directly addressed by this court. Do you understand me?" Sterling swallowed hard, the color draining from his face as he slowly lowered himself back into his seat. Trent was visibly shaking now. He reached under the table, gripping Valerie by the arm, his knuckles turning white. The $5 million debt, the violent loan shark syndicate, the imminent deadline, everything was collapsing right in front of his eyes. He had built his entire survival strategy on the fundamental assumption that I was a weak, vulnerable target. He had never bothered to look past the grandfatherly exterior to see the monster lurking in the shadows. I stepped out from behind the defense table and walked slowly toward the center of the room. My boots clicked with a measured, predatory rhythm against the polished marble floor. I did not need a briefcase full of fabricated evidence. I did not need a sleazy attorney to speak for me. I possessed the absolute truth, and I was going to use it to completely bury the people who had murdered my beloved wife. "Your Honor," I began, my voice echoing clearly off the high acoustic ceilings. "I am not here today to simply contest a fraudulent medical petition. I am here to expose a massive, coordinated criminal conspiracy. The individuals sitting at the plaintiff table are not deeply concerned family members desperately seeking medical intervention for a declining patriarch. They are desperate, violent predators who have systematically orchestrated a plan to steal $10 million in liquid assets to cover a catastrophic gambling debt owed to a violent criminal syndicate operating out of Chicago." Trent shot up from his chair, his face flushed dark red with pure panic. "That is a lie," he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at me. "He is delusional. He is making everything up. You have the medical report." "Your Honor, look at the report." I turned my head slowly, locking my gaze onto Trent. He immediately stopped shouting, freezing under the weight of my stare. "The medical report you submitted to this court is a complete forgery," I stated calmly, addressing the judge while keeping my eyes fixed on my son-in-law. "It was purchased 2 weeks ago for the sum of $20,000 from a disgraced, unlicensed physician named Dr. Elias Vance. I have the digital wire transfer receipts, the encrypted email communications, and the offshore banking routing numbers explicitly detailing the bribe. Furthermore, the affidavit you are currently holding is post-dated for Wednesday morning, perfectly aligning with their scheduled plan to have me involuntarily removed from my property by an unauthorized medical transport team. They were not waiting for my mind to decline Mitchell. They were actively manufacturing my legal death." Judge Weaver looked down at the document in his hands, his eyes narrowing as he finally noticed the fraudulent timestamp printed clearly in the top right corner. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He slowly placed the forged document down onto his desk, his expression darkening into a mask of pure judicial fury. "But the financial fraud and the medical forgery are only the beginning," I continued, my voice dropping into a cold, lethal whisper that carried effortlessly across the room. I took another step forward, closing the distance between myself and the plaintiff table. Valerie was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes, her breath catching in her throat. She knew exactly what I was going to say next. She knew her perfect, wealthy life was completely over. Last night I stated never breaking eye contact with my daughter. I obtained a live, uncoerced, digitally recorded confession from the individuals sitting right in front of you. A confession detailing exactly how they locked my wife inside her bedroom 2 years ago, deliberately withholding her life-saving medication during a cardiac event, and happily listening to her gasp for air until she died, so they could protect their future inheritance. The courtroom erupted into total chaos, signaling their ultimate doom. The courtroom erupted into total chaos, signaling their ultimate doom. I did not raise my voice over the sudden uproar. I did not even look at the frantic, sputtering attorney who was now desperately trying to distance himself from his clients. Instead, I calmly reached inside the deep interior pocket of my worn canvas jacket and withdrew the thick, sealed manila envelope Veronica had personally delivered to my study. I walked directly toward the elevated mahogany bench, bypassing the standard protocol of handing evidence to the bailiff first. Judge Weaver leaned forward, his eyes locked onto the package with absolute razor-sharp intensity. He knew better than to interrupt me. He knew the predator standing before him was executing a meticulously calculated kill. I placed the heavy dossier onto the polished wood of the judge's bench. I did not bother arguing the merits of the fabricated medical evaluation. Debating the psychiatric merits of a forged document was a profound waste of my time. I simply unclasped the envelope and slid the first stack of financial records directly under Weaver's gaze. Your Honor, the first document you are looking at is a comprehensive forensic accounting report. I stated, my voice echoing with icy, unyielding authority. It details a catastrophic $5 million gambling debt incurred by Trent Lawson over the past 18 months. The debt is held by an organized violent criminal syndicate operating out of Chicago. You will see the corresponding text messages, the encrypted communications, and the explicit threats on his life, demanding full payment by this coming Friday. I slid the second stack of papers forward. Trent let out a strangled, pathetic gasp behind me. I did not turn around. The second set of documents outlines a series of wire transfers routed through offshore accounts. I continued tapping the paper with my index finger. These transfers amount to exactly $20,000, deposited directly into the Cayman Island accounts of Dr. Elias Vance. This is the very same disgraced physician who supposedly conducted a thorough psychological evaluation of my mental state, despite the fact that I have not been in the same room as a doctor in over 3 years. They bribed him to sign the affidavit, knowing the court would likely process an emergency conservatorship without a secondary medical review. They needed unrestricted access to my liquid assets by Wednesday afternoon to prevent Trent from being murdered by his creditors. Judge Weaver flipped through the financial records, his face hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated judicial fury. The paper trail was absolute. It was undeniable, legally acquired evidence compiled by the best private investigator in the state. Marcus Sterling, their high-priced attorney, had completely backed away from the plaintiff table. His hands raised in the air as if trying to physically shield himself from the radioactive fallout. But financial ruin is merely the prologue to this atrocity, I said, my voice dropping into a register of cold, terrifying finality. I reached into my pocket one last time and retrieved a small silver USB drive. I held it up for the judge to see. I submitted a formal request to this court over a decade ago to upgrade the audio and visual technology in this exact room. I assume the speaker system is still fully operational. Judge Weaver did not say a word. He simply gestured to the court clerk sitting at the terminal below the bench. I walked over and handed the silver drive to the clerk. Plug it in and play the only audio file on the drive, I commanded. Play it directly through the main courtroom speakers. The clerk fumbled nervously with the device, plugging it into the port. A heavy, suffocating silence descended over the room. No one dared to breathe. Trent was shaking so violently that his heavy wooden chair rattled against the marble floor. Valerie sat perfectly still, her face drained of all color, her eyes wide with the horrifying realization of what was about to happen. A sharp electronic hiss filled the massive chamber, followed immediately by the unmistakable, panicked voice of Trent Lawson. "Keep your voice down," Trent hissed through the speakers. "Are you out of your mind, Valerie? You do not ever talk about that. Not here, not anywhere." Then came the cold, dismissive laugh of my daughter echoing off the dark oak panels of the courtroom. "Oh, please. Who is going to hear us, Trent? The storm outside is drowning out everything else." I closed my eyes. Hearing it again did not lessen the pain, but the pain was entirely eclipsed by the necessity of justice. I opened my eyes and stared directly at Valerie as her own voice condemned her to hell. "We do not do it in front of them," the recorded. Valerie snarled through the speakers, her tone dripping with venom. "We do it before they arrive. We stop waiting for the forged papers to do the heavy lifting. We take absolute control of the situation tonight. Let us just handle him exactly how we handled Mom." The audio continued detailing the horrific, agonizing 4 minutes my beloved Diane had spent locked inside our bedroom, begging for her medication, while her daughter stood in the hallway and listened to her die. Every monstrous detail, every cold calculation, every ounce of their lethal greed played out loud and clear for the judge, the bailiffs, and the court clerks to hear. It was a flawless, irrefutable confession to murder in the first degree. The recording clicked off, leaving behind a silence so absolute, it felt like a physical weight crushing the air out of the room. Then absolute chaos erupted. Trent snapped. The primal, desperate instinct of a cornered animal completely took over his fragile mind. He kicked his chair backward, letting out a terrified guttural scream, and lunged toward the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom. He did not make it 3 steps. The 2 massive court bailiffs who had escorted me from my home reacted with lightning speed. They crossed the aisle in a blur of dark uniforms, violently tackling Trent to the marble floor. The sickening crunch of bone hitting stone echoed loudly as they pinned his arms behind his back, driving their heavy knees into his spine. Trent sobbed and thrashed, but he was completely immobilized. Valerie did not run. Her legs could no longer support her. She slid out of her chair, dropping heavily to her knees in her expensive black designer dress. The aristocratic, untouchable facade was entirely shattered. She was weeping hysterically, her perfectly styled hair falling in messy strands across her tear-soaked face. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, reaching her trembling arms out toward me across the center aisle. "Dad!" She wailed, her voice a ragged, desperate screech that tore through the chaos. "Dad, please. I am so sorry. It was a mistake. Trent made me do it. He forced me. Dad, please look at me. I am your little girl. I am your daughter. Please help me." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the weeping, broken creature groveling on the floor. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no parental bond. The woman kneeling before me was nothing more than a parasite that had fed on the love and generosity of the woman she had murdered. I looked at her with eyes like solid ice. "My daughter died with her mother that night," I stated. My voice was quiet, but it sliced through her hysterical sobbing with devastating precision. "You are nothing to me." Judge Mitchell Weaver slammed his heavy wooden gavel down onto the sounding block. The sharp, explosive crack silenced the remaining murmurs in the gallery. His face was pale, his jaw set in a rigid line of absolute disgust. "I am immediately revoking the emergency petition for conservatorship," Judge Weaver roared, pointing his gavel directly at the defense table. "I am ordering the immediate detention of Trent and Valerie Lawson. Bailiffs place them both under formal arrest. They are to be held without bail, pending immediate criminal charges for grand fraud, severe elder abuse, and the premeditated cold-blooded murder of Diane Caldwell. Get these monsters out of my courtroom immediately." They were dragged away, screaming. I watched the heavy courtroom doors swing shut behind them, cutting off the frantic, pathetic sounds of their desperate pleas. The silence that settled over the room was profound, heavy with the undeniable weight of absolute justice. Judge Weaver offered me a solemn, respectful nod, before adjourning the session, a silent acknowledgement between 2 men who understood the terrible cost of the truth. I gathered my battered baseball cap from the defense table and walked out of the building. The freezing winter air hit my face, but for the first time in 2 years, I did not feel the bitter, agonizing chill of grief. I felt completely awake. Weeks later, the sprawling estate in Bucks County was finally quiet. It was a crisp, clear morning, the kind of morning Diane used to love. I stood in the center of the master bedroom, the very room where they had coldly orchestrated her murder. But today, the room was not a sanctuary of sorrow. It was a site of cleansing. I carried a thick, heavy-duty trash bag, pulling Valerie's obscenely expensive designer dresses, silk blouses, and imported shoes from the massive walk-in closet. I did not fold them. I shoved them into the black plastic, treating the garments with the exact level of respect she had shown her own mother. I hauled the bulging bags down the grand staircase, my boots thudding rhythmically against the hardwood. Out in the gravel driveway, a rented industrial dumpster sat waiting. I hoisted the heavy bags over the rusted metal rim, listening to the satisfying thud as they hit the bottom. Trent's tailored suits, his custom Italian leather shoes, his expensive silk ties, all of it followed. I threw away every physical trace of their parasitic existence in my home. I was erasing them systematically and completely ensuring that nothing of theirs would ever taint this sanctuary again. The legal fallout from that single morning in court had been swift, brutal, and entirely devastating for them. The audio recording, combined with Veronica's meticulously gathered financial evidence, had constructed an inescapable steel trap. The district attorney, a sharp, aggressive prosecutor I had personally mentored decades ago, did not offer plea deals. Trent and Valerie were formally denied bail. They were currently sitting in separate maximum security federal detention centers facing life sentences without the possibility of parole for murder, in the first-degree severe elder abuse and massive financial fraud. There would be no high-priced lawyers to save them. The assets they had planned to steal were frozen by the federal court order. Furthermore, the digital dossier Veronica had compiled on Trent's gambling debts did not just secure his conviction. I had personally ensured that a secure copy of the encrypted communications, the offshore routing numbers, and the syndicate's operational details were delivered directly to the regional director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. 2 days after Trent's arrest, a massive coordinated federal raid swept through the Chicago underworld, severely crippling the very loan shark syndicate that had driven Trent to murder. The criminal enterprise was dismantled, their assets seized, and their leadership indicted. Trent had brought violent monsters to my doorstep, so I burned their entire house down to the ground. I finished tossing the last bag of their belongings into the dumpster and wiped my hands on my denim trousers. The physical labor felt incredibly rewarding, a tangible manifestation of removing the rot from my life. I walked back into the silent house, my footsteps echoing in the massive foyer, and made my way to my private study. The heavy oak desk felt familiar, comforting, a symbol of the authority I had reclaimed. I sat in my high-backed leather chair, looking at the framed photograph of Diane resting on the corner of the desk. Her smile gave me strength. I picked up the telephone and dialed the direct line to my primary legal counsel. We had vital, transformative work to do. I instructed my attorneys to immediately liquidate a significant portion of my financial portfolio. I was establishing a new, aggressively funded philanthropic organization. It would be formally registered as the Diane Caldwell Trust. The foundation's sole mission would be to provide elite, relentless legal representation for vulnerable, abused, and financially exploited elderly citizens who could not defend themselves. I was taking the $10 million that Valerie and Trent had murdered my wife to steal, and I was using it to hunt down predators exactly like them. Every dollar would be a weapon forged to protect the defenseless. Diane had wanted her wealth to help the vulnerable. I was going to ensure her final wish was honored with devastating efficiency. With the legal instructions finalized and the trust officially set into motion, I felt an immense, profound sense of closure wash over my spirit. I walked through the grand hallway, passing the antique grandfather clock that stood as a testament to the enduring passage of time, and stepped out onto the wide wrap-around back porch. The sun was climbing higher in the pale winter sky, casting long, sharp shadows across the frost-covered lawn. The sprawling acres of Bucks County stretched out before me, peaceful and completely undisturbed. The massive oak trees swayed gently in the cold breeze, standing as silent witnesses to the turbulent storm that had finally passed, leaving behind a profound stillness. I held a steaming mug of black coffee in my hands, feeling the comforting warmth radiating through the ceramic. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The dark roast was bitter strong and grounding. I looked out over the quiet landscape. The estate was completely empty now. There were no fake smiles, no whispered conspiracies, no toxic greed poisoning the air. For the first time since the devastating night, I lost Diane. I took a deep breath, and the air genuinely felt clean. The suffocating weight of the manufactured tragedy was gone. I was alone, but I was not lonely. I had survived the ultimate horrific betrayal. I had faced the monsters hiding in my own home, and I had destroyed them. I was no longer a grieving victim. I had emerged as the unyielding guardian of my own reclaimed life, my own absolute truth, and the beautiful entirety of my wife's enduring legacy. The most dangerous enemies do not always wear masks. Sometimes they wear the faces of the people we raised. We are taught that blood is an unbreakable bond, but greed can easily poison even the deepest roots of a family tree. True strength is not found in turning a blind eye to the betrayal of our loved ones just to keep the peace. It is found in having the absolute courage to face the agonizing truth, to demand justice for those who can no longer speak, and to realize that our legacy is entirely defined by our own unyielding integrity. If my story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What city are you watching? From what time is it there? And would you have the courage to put your own child in prison? See you in the next story.